The day I walked into that courtroom, my daughter Julie rolled her eyes toward her husband Trent, as if I were nothing more than some cranky old woman wasting everyone's time. But when the judge looked up and saw me, the entire room seemed to freeze, his voice dropping as he whispered with shock in his eyes, "Mrs. Margaret Wilson, is it really you?" And for a brief moment, the entire court fell into a suffocating silence while Julie and her smug husband exchanged uneasy glances, panic flickering across their faces even as they tried to compose themselves. And though that confrontation would eventually change everything, I want to start at the beginning, with the ordinary life I had lived up until 6 months earlier, when I was nothing more than a 70-year-old widow in a quiet suburb outside of Philadelphia. A grandmother who rose at 5:30 every morning, poured steaming coffee into the same chipped ceramic mug my late husband Charles had given me on our 30th anniversary, and tended to the orchids on the windowsill while watching the pink streaks of dawn spread across the sky. A simple, repetitive routine that gave me comfort and connection to the man I had loved for nearly half a century. Because for almost 50 years, I had been the kind of mother who sacrificed everything for her only child, Julie. Working days as a house cleaner, nights hemming clothes as a seamstress, and weekends selling homemade pies at the church bazaar, just to afford the kind of education and future I never had. And when Julie eventually married Trent, a man with calculating gray eyes and a smile that never seemed to reach them, I swallowed my misgivings and opened my home every Sunday, serving fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green bean casserole with a smile stretched thin over the unease in my chest, hoping against hope that the family I had built with Charles would stay together, especially after his death when I thought Julie and I might finally grow closer again. But instead of comfort and companionship, she seemed to drift further away, visiting me out of duty rather than affection, her phone calls growing shorter, her glances around the home I had raised her in becoming more appraising than nostalgic, as though she no longer saw a house filled with memories of Christmas mornings, scraped knees, and graduations, but instead saw an asset ripe for the taking. And I didn't realize just how far things had gone until one gray October Tuesday when the rain beat against the kitchen windows and I prepared pot roast with carrots, Julie's childhood favorite, setting the table with the embroidered tablecloth I had stitched the year she left for college, even placing fresh chrysanthemums in a vase just to make it special. But when the front door opened without a knock and Trent strutted in like the master of the house, collapsing onto Charles's old recliner and flipping on the television without so much as a greeting, followed by Julie carrying a manila folder and that distant look that belonged to a stranger rather than the daughter who used to slip her hand into mine with unshakable trust, my stomach turned cold. And when she finally sat down, perching on the sofa's edge as though she could barely stand being there, her words cut deeper than any blade. "Mom, we need to talk," she said in a tone devoid of warmth. "Trent and I have decided this house is too big for you. You can't maintain it alone, and we found a wonderful assisted living facility with activities, medical care, and people your age." And though I tried to protest, reminding her this was the house Charles and I had built together brick by brick, the place where every milestone of her life had been celebrated, Trent muted the TV and, straightening his expensive silk tie, interrupted with his usual chilling smugness. "Memories live in your head, Margaret, not in these walls. And that place has a garden. You'll like it." But the truth in his eyes betrayed him. This wasn't about my well-being. It was about taking the home Charles and I had sacrificed decades for. And when Julie slid that folder across the table filled with pre-signed documents, all I had to do was add my signature to erase my past. I felt my throat close. And when I refused, her tone sharpened, Trent's patience snapped, and suddenly they were accusing me of forgetfulness, of supposedly leaving the stove on, fabricating dangers to paint me as incapable. their campaign intensifying over the following weeks as they brought realtors unannounced to walk through my rooms as though I were invisible, talking about remodeling my kitchen, while Julie boxed up my belongings without permission, dismissing the dress I'd worn to Charles's funeral as outdated junk, tossing aside letters he had written me in his careful hand, albums of our vacations, and even the little jewelry box he'd carved for me on our first anniversary, a box that held not only trinkets, but the pearl necklace my mother had left me. And when Julie tucked it into her purse with the excuse, "I'll keep it safe so nothing disappears at the facility," I saw for the first time in my daughter's eyes, not care, not even apathy, but naked greed disguised as concern. And that night, as I lay awake hearing them whisper in the living room about how to deal with the obstacle I had become, I wept harder than I had since Charles's passing. Not from grief, but from outrage that the child I had poured my life into could see me nothing more than an inconvenient hurdle. But within those tears, something hardened. A spark of defiance I hadn't known it was left in me. A vow that I would not be discarded quietly, not be erased from my own life. And I had no idea then that Charles, always cautious and meticulous, had anticipated this very moment, leaving behind secrets locked away that would change everything. Secrets that would shift the balance of power back into my hands. But all I knew as dawn broke the next day was that I would fight with every ounce of strength left in me, because if my own flesh and blood thought I was powerless, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The morning after that stormy night, Julie arrived earlier than usual, her arms loaded with cardboard boxes and her voice full of forced authority, as she announced they would start clearing out Charles's office, the one room in the house I had kept untouched since his funeral 3 years earlier, a sanctuary still smelling faintly of his aftershave, the desk arranged exactly as he had left it, his fountain pen resting atop a ledger, our wedding photo in its silver frame smiling back at me whenever I stepped inside. And when Julie marched down the hallway declaring, "Mom, it's time to stop clinging to the past. We'll start with Dad's office today," I felt a sudden jolt of steel in my spine and snapped back with a firmness that startled even me. No, that room is not to be touched. But she rolled her eyes and muttered about sanctuaries and sales, reminding me yet again that in her mind, the house was already on the market, the sale pending only my reluctant cooperation. And as she stepped outside to fetch more boxes from the car, I slipped into Charles's office, locking the door behind me, breathing in the quiet refuge that had shielded me for years, letting my hand wander over the books he had so carefully organized, the files labeled in his neat handwriting, until my fingers brushed against the top shelf of an old bookcase where, hidden behind a row of dusty encyclopedias, I discovered something I had never noticed in our 47 years of marriage. A small safe built into the wall, its dial worn smooth from use, and though my hands shook, I turned it slowly, trying dates I thought might matter. Our wedding anniversary, his birthday, Julie's birthday, all failures, until in a desperate burst of instinct, I tried the date of that rainy Sunday when Charles and I had first met, two strangers seeking shelter beneath the awning of a corner bakery in downtown Philadelphia. And with a faint click, the safe door creaked open to reveal a leather folder embossed with his initials, the sight of which sent my breath shallow and my knees weak, because inside were documents that turned my world upside down, deeds to properties I'd never known we owned, bank statements from accounts in my name that I had never touched, certificates of stock in well-known companies, life insurance policies with staggering values, and at the center of it all, a sealed envelope addressed to me in Charles's unmistakable hand, and when I unfolded the letter, tears blurred the ink as his voice seemed to rise from the page. He confessed that for decades he had quietly invested every spare dollar, building a financial empire in my name, deliberately hidden because he had never trusted Trent's ambition or Julie's susceptibility to it, warning me gently that if I were ever forced into a corner, these assets were my shield. a way to ensure my dignity and safety, adding a clause that Julie would only inherit if she treated me with the same love I had always shown her, and otherwise I alone would hold full control. Use this wisely, my love, not to seek vengeance, but to protect yourself, he had written. And I sat on the carpet surrounded by evidence that the modest life I thought we'd led had been a facade Charles built to protect me, evidence that even the upscale condo where Julie and Trent lived wasn't theirs at all, but mine. Rent funneled to me through an anonymous property manager, and more shocking still, shares in the very corporation where Trent worked, a stake significant enough to sway board decisions about his own future. And I couldn't help but laugh bitterly through my sobs at the irony that while they plotted to strip me of my small brick home, I held the keys to assets far greater than they could imagine. Yet the pounding of Julie's fists on the office door snapped me back, her voice sharp. "Mom, open up this instant!" And hastily I slipped the most crucial documents into my handbag, returned the rest to the safe, and composed my face before unlocking the door, greeting her with a calmness that confused her, telling her she might be right. Maybe it was time to consider moving forward, her suspicions softening into relief as she believed she had finally broken me. "I'm glad you're being reasonable, Mom. You'll see it's for the best," she said with a triumphant smile, never realizing the power that now sat in my purse. And that evening, as they toasted their supposed victory with a bottle of red wine in my living room, I made a quiet phone call to a number Charles had scribbled in his notes, an attorney named Eleanor Hayes in downtown Philadelphia. And when she answered, her voice brisk yet warm, I introduced myself as Margaret Wilson, widow of Charles Wilson, and asked for her help with urgent matters regarding my inheritance. And after hanging up, I turned to the photograph of Charles on my nightstand, whispering, "You always knew, didn't you, my love? You always knew this day would come," before slipping into the first restful sleep I had enjoyed in months. Not as a woman resigned to being discarded, but as someone who had just uncovered the weapons of her defense. And when I finally sat across from Eleanor in her sleep office 3 days later, sipping coffee she had offered while she spread copies of the documents I'd emailed her across a polished oak desk, she confirmed what Charles had promised. That everything was legally airtight, incontestable, and irrevocably mine. "Mrs. Wilson, your husband was extraordinarily thorough. Every investment legitimate, every account secure, the trust structure ironclad, and the will unbreakable," she explained, noting with professional admiration the behavioral clause Charles had written, a stipulation that Julie and Trent would only inherit if they cared for me with love and respect, a clause their actions had already violated beyond dispute. And when I asked what I should do, overwhelmed by the immensity of it all, Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes sharp with determination. "First, do not sign anything they present, no matter the pressure. Second, maintain the illusion you remain unaware. The more they expose themselves, the stronger our case. And third, let them believe they've won for now. Ask to visit the facility, pretend you're considering it, let them keep talking, and we will collect every ounce of evidence." And so began weeks of a cruel charade where I feigned weary surrender, letting Julie box up my life while I secretly recorded every word on my phone as Eleanor instructed, capturing Trent bragging to a shady physician he brought to declare me unfit without even examining me, capturing Julie slipping my jewelry into her purse while pretending to safeguard it, capturing whispered conversations about how quickly they could remodel once I was gone. Each recording another brick in the fortress Eleanor was building around me, and though it tore at my soul to watch them dismantle the life Charles and I had created, I clung to the knowledge that every indignity only strengthened the reckoning to come. And one afternoon, while Julie cataloged my belongings in the living room, I casually mentioned perhaps giving her the pearl necklace from her grandmother before leaving, watching her freeze mid-motion, her cheeks flushing as she lied that she hadn't seen it in years, and I tucked away her guilt, reporting it later to Eleanor, who smiled coldly, "Perfect. That's theft we can document." And when Sunday came, they drove me to the assisted living facility they had promised was paradise, but it reeked of antiseptic, poorly masking urine. Its cramped rooms filled with glazed-eyed residents slumped in wheelchairs, staring blankly at an ancient television. And when I asked, "How much does this place cost?" Trent answered smugly, "Don't worry, selling your house will cover it for years." And when I pressed, "And if I live longer than the money lasts?" Their silence screamed their indifference, and I knew then I would never forgive them, though I played along, nodding, feigning uncertainty, until we returned home, where they discussed tearing down walls and turning Charles's office into a guest room or a walk-in closet. Their voices buzzing with greedy excitement while I stared out the car window, hiding the tears that burned my eyes. And that night, as I phoned Eleanor, I said the words that marked the turning point of everything. "I'm ready. It's time to move forward with the plan." 2 days later, Julie and Trent returned. This time, dragging along a man in a cheap suit they introduced as their lawyer, though Eleanor would later confirm he was nothing more than one of Trent's real estate buddies, posing as legal counsel. And they spread the transfer papers across my kitchen table with the kind of smug certainty that made my stomach churn. Julie's voice clipped as she instructed, "All you need to do is sign here and here, Mom, and we'll finalize your move next week." While Trent smirked from across the table, tapping his Mont Blanc pen like a gavel of doom. But before I could respond, the doorbell rang, and with the sweetest mask I could summon, I said, "Oh, that must be my friend Martha. She's coming to help me pack." And when Trent yanked the door open, expecting a timid church friend, his face drained of color as Eleanor stepped in, flanked by a uniformed court officer and a state social worker, her presence filling the room with an authority that even Julie recognized instantly. And as she laid her briefcase on the table, she introduced herself coolly. "Good afternoon. I am attorney Eleanor Hayes, representing Mrs. Margaret Wilson in matters of attempted fraud and elder abuse." And in that moment, Julie's complexion turned ashen. Trent shifted in his seat, and the social worker began taking notes as the officer surveyed the half-empty rooms, the boxes stacked in corners, the unsigned documents littering the table, all silent witnesses to months of coercion. And Eleanor, with the poise of a woman who had won battles far tougher than this, demanded to know whether these papers had been reviewed by independent counsel, knowing perfectly well they hadn't, while she outlined the evidence of stolen jewelry, unauthorized financial transfers, and coercive tactics recorded on my phone. And I watched, my heart pounding, as Julie's face crumbled from anger to panic to tears, whispering, "Mom, what did you do?" And I rose slowly, clutching the handbag that now carried Charles's secrets, my voice steady as I answered, "I did what your father always knew I would have to do someday. I defended myself." And while the officer photographed every corner of the house, every packed box, every forged paper, Eleanor pressed further, warning Trent and Julie that attempting to declare me mentally unfit with falsified medical claims was itself a felony. Pulling from her folder transcripts of their own words, recordings so damning Trent went pale, stammering objections Eleanor brushed aside with icy calm, and Julie broke completely then, collapsing into a chair sobbing, "Mom, we're your family. Why are you doing this?" And I looked at her through tears of my own, answering with the weight of years in my voice. "Because it was as family that you boxed my memories like garbage, pocketed the pearls from your grandmother without asking, and plotted to leave me to rot in a run-down nursing home so you could take this house. And if family means betrayal, manipulation, and theft, then I want no part of it." And the social worker nodded solemnly, writing furiously, while Eleanor presented bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals from my accounts leading directly to their joint account, proof undeniable. And when Julie gasped, "I didn't know, I swear, I never touched your money," I replied with an ache so deep it surprised even me, "No, Julie, maybe you didn't. But you let him. You let him convince you I was senile. You let him pack away your father's legacy like it was nothing. You chose his voice over mine." And Trent, cornered and desperate, tried to argue that this was a family misunderstanding, that it didn't need to involve lawyers or courts, but Eleanor cut him off with precision, listing the fraudulent medical evaluation, the attempted illegal property transfer, and the elder financial exploitation statutes he had violated. And she slid across the table a temporary restraining order preventing either of them from touching the house or my possessions, ordering the return of stolen property, particularly the jewelry, and instructing that any further attempt to interfere would result in criminal charges. And when the officer handed them official copies, Trent's bravado finally cracked, his hands trembling as he muttered, How much, how much is all of this worth?" His eyes darted toward the folder I had carried, but Eleanor's smirk was sharp as glass when she replied, "More than you could repay in 10 lifetimes of honest work, Mr. Davis. And that's all you need to know." And when they were finally escorted out, Julie still weeping and Trent seething silently, my knees buckled with exhaustion. And Eleanor guided me gently to the sofa, her hand steady on my shoulder as she whispered, "You were brave today, Margaret. Not many could stand up to their own child like that." And though tears streamed down my cheeks, I confessed, I don't know if it was bravery or desperation, I just knew I couldn't let them win. To which she answered, "Sometimes they're the same thing." And in the days that followed, the fallout was immediate. Trent vanished from his job, requesting sudden leave, while Julie called repeatedly, begging me to listen, each time leaving voicemails laced with confusion and regret that I ignored on Eleanor's advice. And when a week later she returned to my doorstep, dark circles beneath her eyes, carrying boxes of my jewelry, photo albums, and Charles's letters, setting them carefully on my dining table with trembling hands, she admitted through tears that Trent had left her, blaming her for failing to secure the house, draining their bank accounts before disappearing, leaving her with debt and humiliation. And though part of me longed to hold my daughter and comfort her, another part remembered every cruel word, every box she had filled with my past, and I simply asked, "Why, Julie? After everything I gave you, why did you believe him over me?" And she crumpled, sobbing that it was easier to believe I needed help than admit she had married a man who only cared about money, confessing that when Trent first suggested selling the house, she resisted. But his constant whispers about my memory, his planting of doubt, and her own hidden guilt for not being the daughter I deserved made her vulnerable. And eventually, she surrendered because wanting the house meant burying her conscience. And as she spoke, I saw not just greed, but shame in her eyes. And when she asked, "What do you want me to do now, Mom?" I slid a folder across the table containing a contract I'd drafted with Eleanor's help, explaining that I was founding the Charles Wilson Foundation to help elderly victims of family abuse and financial exploitation, and offering her a position with modest pay and housing in the small guest house behind my home, not as charity, but as a path to redemption. Her tears spilling anew as she whispered, "Why would you do this after everything?" And I answered with the words Charles had left me. Because forgiveness isn't earned, it's given. And though I can't forgive you completely, I can give you the chance to prove your father was right to still believe in you. And as she clutched the contract with trembling hands, I knew this was only the beginning of our long road, one where pain and betrayal would mingle with the fragile hope of reconciliation. But for the first time in months, I felt the faintest glimmer that perhaps not all was lost between us. Even as the shadow of Trent loomed, his whereabouts unknown, his schemes unfinished, and a gnawing sense that the battle for my dignity and for others like me was far from over. The weeks that followed felt like walking a tightrope between fragile peace and the storm that still lingered in the distance. Because while Julie tried to prove her sincerity by showing up at the Foundation's modest office each morning to help file papers, answer phones, and shadow Eleanor during client consultations, I knew that real redemption would take time and grit, not just appearances. And in the meantime, Eleanor and I continued to build the case against Trent, documenting every fraudulent act, every forged signature, every manipulative conversation, preparing for the day he would inevitably resurface, because men like him never disappear quietly. And sure enough, word trickled back through Eleanor's network that Trent had resigned from his corporate job under suspicious circumstances, sold off most of his possessions, and was planning to leave the country, his sights set on Miami as a launch point for disappearing overseas. And when Eleanor called with the update, her voice calm but edged with urgency, "Margaret, he's trying to liquidate what's left and run. If we're going to stop him, we need testimony. Yours and Julie's if she's willing." My chest tightened with dread, but also resolve, because though I had never imagined myself standing in a courtroom again, the memory of the judge whispering my name weeks earlier reminded me that sometimes fate circles back in unexpected ways. And so we pressed forward, building not just a legal case, but a movement. Because as Julie sat across from me one night at the kitchen table, her face still worn from the collapse of her marriage, she asked through tears, "Mom, how many other people go through this? How many other daughters and sons do to their parents what I did to you?" And I answered with a heaviness that came from stories Eleanor had begun sharing with me. Stories of seniors tricked into signing over deeds, of grandmothers robbed by their own grandchildren, of widows locked away in facilities while their assets were stripped. And I told her, "Far too many, Julie. And that's why your father left me this fortune. Not just to protect me, but to give us the chance to fight back for others." And that was when the seed of the Charles Wilson Foundation truly took root, when we stopped thinking of it as just a shield for me and began shaping it into a weapon of protection for countless others, holding planning meetings around my dining table, reaching out to churches, senior centers, and legal aid societies, piecing together a network of allies who could help expose elder abuse and financial exploitation. And as Julie threw herself into the work, I watched a change begin to flicker in her. The arrogance nulting, replaced by a grim determination, as though she believed that by helping others, she could atone for her betrayal of me. And slowly, grudgingly, I let myself believe that maybe Charles had been right to trust in her eventual return to decency. But the shadow of Trent never left. And when Eleanor summoned us one afternoon with fresh evidence that he was orchestrating a broader scheme, targeting widows with property, convincing them they were incompetent, then transferring their homes into shell companies, I felt the old rage surge back, a fiery determination that no one else would suffer what I had endured. And Eleanor laid out the plan with methodical precision, explaining that federal investigators were already involved, but they needed first-hand testimony to connect Trent's scams. "He's gotten bolder, Margaret, because he believes he got close to winning with you, and he's using the same playbook with other women. But your recordings, your documentation, your story, it ties everything together." And though Julie paled at the thought of testifying, her voice cracked but steady when she said, "I'll do it, Mom. I need to face what he turned me into. I need to make this right." And I looked at her across the conference table, seeing in her the faint echo of the little girl who used to sit on my lap with picture books, and I nodded, knowing this was her chance not just to stand with me, but to finally stand against him. And so the preparations began. Endless meetings with Eleanor where we practiced my testimony until the words felt etched into my bones. Julie rehearsing her own admissions of manipulation and guilt, Eleanor coaching us to remain calm under cross-examination, to hold steady when Trent inevitably tried to twist the narrative into one of a misunderstood son-in-law. And the night before the hearing, I sat alone in Charles's office, the letter folder open on the desk, rereading his letter until the words blurred through my tears, whispering into the stillness, "I'll use this wisely, Charles, not just for me, but for everyone you wanted me to protect." And when dawn broke, Julie and I dressed in muted colors, our faces pale but resolute, and walked into that courthouse together, every eye turning as we entered, because by then our story had attracted media attention through the Foundation's early work, reporters lining the steps outside, elderly women clutching my hands with whispers of "thank you" and "don't let them win." And when we sat down at the witness table, my heart pounded with a mix of terror and pride, because though I never wanted to be here, I knew this was exactly where Charles had intended me to stand. And when Trent was brought in, shackled but smirking, his expensive taste reduced to an ill-fitting suit borrowed for court, his eyes met mine with a flash of cold fury before he masked it with that practiced charm. And the proceedings began, the prosecutor methodically laying out his pattern of deceit, while Eleanor sat by my side as co-counsel, her presence a rock against the tide of fear. And when my turn came, when I swore on the Bible and spoke my name into the microphone, The judge, an older man with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up sharply, recognition flashing across his face, and in a hushed tone, barely audible to the court, he said, "Mrs. Wilson, you, it's you." And in that instant, memories cascaded back because I remembered him too. Decades ago, as a nervous law clerk, I had once encouraged during long evenings at the courthouse where I worked as a secretary, when I brought him coffee and kind words others had denied him. And now, here he sat as the presiding judge over the man who had tried to strip me of my dignity. And though he quickly regained his composure, inviting me to continue my testimony, the silent connection between us was undeniable, a reminder that kindness sown decades earlier could bloom in the most unexpected of ways. And with that anchor steadying me, I began to tell my story, not just of Trent and Julie's betrayal, but of Charles's foresight, of the hidden empire he had built to safeguard me, of the nights I lay awake believing my life was over, only to find the strength to fight. And as I spoke, I felt the eyes of the courtroom on me, the sympathy of strangers, the admiration of those who saw in me their own mothers and grandmothers. And though Trent's lawyer tried to paint me as confused, forgetful, prone to memory lapses, I countered with crystal clear recollections, detailing dates, conversations, even the day the young clerk, now judge, had walked into that courthouse decades earlier in a suit too large for his frame. And silence fell, thick and unshakable, as my words cut through the falsehoods, reclaiming the narrative Trent had tried to script. And when Julie took the stand next, her voice breaking but firm as she admitted her complicity, described the manipulation, the way Trent had planted doubt and eroded her loyalty until she believed her own mother was incompetent, the court gasped softly, not in condemnation, but in recognition of the insidiousness of abuse. And I sat in awe as my daughter, my betrayer, became my ally, choosing truth over shame. And in that moment, I understood what Charles had meant, that forgiveness is not a single act, but a journey, one we had only just begun. The trial stretched into 3 grueling days that tested every ounce of my endurance, because while I had expected Trent to deny and deflect, I hadn't anticipated the performance he staged when it was his turn to testify, standing tall with crocodile tears glistening as he painted himself as a dutiful son-in-law, misinterpreted by a bitter old woman, insisting that every action he took was out of concern for my safety, that Julie had begged him to intervene because I was allegedly leaving burners lit and misplacing important mail. And at first his voice carried that same charm that had fooled so many over the years, the kind of polished confidence that had helped him climb in the corporate ladder. But then the prosecution methodically dismantled his facade, rolling out the damning evidence Eleanor and I had spent weeks gathering, my secret recordings in which his voice was unmistakably clear as he admitted to fabricating stories about me forgetting the stove, his smug laughter when he told Julie she'd thank him later for speeding up the process, the fraudulent medical evaluation conducted by his so-called doctor friend that I had captured in full on my phone, and the financial records tracing funds siphoned directly from my accounts into his. Each piece of evidence another crack in the mask he wore, until finally the courtroom could no longer pretend this was a family misunderstanding. And when the prosecutor turned to the bench and stated with measured authority, "Your Honor, this is not care. This is coercion, exploitation, and theft against a vulnerable senior," I saw the jurors shift uncomfortably, their eyes narrowing at Trent. And though his attorney tried desperately to recover ground, calling me confused, pointing to my age, pressing on whether I ever misplaced small things like my keys, Eleanor rose like a hawk and objected with a ferocity that silenced the room, then calmly reminded the court that having a 70-year-old woman misplace her glasses is not incompetence, it's humanity. And as if fate itself wanted to underscore the point, Julie's testimony came next. And with trembling hands gripping the rail, she confessed to her own shame, admitting that she had let Trent's manipulations take root because of her own insecurities, that she had convinced herself I was slipping mentally, not because of evidence, but because it was easier than confronting the greed she'd inherited from him. And the gallery fell into a heavy silence as she wept, her words raw and unvarnished. I betrayed my own mother because I wanted to believe the lies, because I wanted the house more than I wanted to face what I had become. And as painful as it was to hear, her candor cut through the lingering doubt, showing the court not just a greedy couple, but the anatomy of abuse, how it festers, how it convinces even loved ones to see shadows where none exist. And when the judge leaned forward, his eyes heavy with memory, his pen scratching notes, I felt in my bones that the tide had turned. And on the third afternoon, as the prosecutor closed with the simple but devastating truth, this man sought to rob not just property, but dignity from the very woman who raised his wife, the courtroom air felt electric, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. And when the judge delivered his verdict, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to shake even the stone walls, he pronounced Trent guilty on all counts: elder abuse, fraud, financial exploitation, and coercion, sentencing him to 12 years in federal prison with restitution to every victim identified. And in that moment, as officers clasped handcuffs around his wrists and led him away, his smirk finally gone, replaced with the pale mask of a man who realized his empire of lies had collapsed, I felt a wave of release so powerful I nearly collapsed. And Eleanor's steady hand was there on my arm, whispering, "It's over, Margaret. He can't hurt you anymore." But even as relief washed over me, I knew in my heart that this was not the end, but the beginning. Because while justice had been served for me, there were countless others whose voices were still silenced, whose children or grandchildren were even now selling their homes out from under them. And that night, back in my kitchen, Julie sat across from me, her eyes red but clearer than I'd seen them in years. And she whispered, "Mom, I don't deserve it, but can you let me help you? Can we take what we've started and make it bigger?" And I thought of Charles, of his letter urging me not to use the fortune for vengeance, but for protection. And I realized the path forward was as clear as the dawn light across my orchids each morning. We would build the Charles Wilson Foundation not as a shield only for me, but as a fortress for every senior standing where I once stood, too afraid to fight alone. And as Julie reached across the table and clasped my hand, her grip trembling but earnest, I understood that while forgiveness would take time, purpose could not wait. And that was how the next chapter of our lives began, forged not in comfort or ease, but in fire and betrayal, tempered into something unbreakable by the knowledge that we had survived, and now we had a mission bigger than ourselves. The weeks after the sentencing were a blur of reporters, community leaders, and elderly neighbors who began coming to my door with their own stories, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Grandmothers tricked into signing over reverse mortgages they never understood, widowers persuaded to move into substandard facilities while relatives emptied their accounts, retirees manipulated by children who whispered about forgetfulness until the house deeds were quietly transferred. And though my own body ached from the exhaustion of trial, I couldn't turn them away, because I saw in every one of their faces the reflection of myself sitting in my kitchen months earlier, believing I was powerless. And so, with Eleanor's guidance and Julie's unexpected determination, we formally launched the Charles Wilson Foundation in a modest brick office in downtown Philadelphia, funded by the assets Charles had hidden all those years. And from the very first week, the phones rang non-stop. Seniors calling from across the state, desperate for advice, church pastors referring parishioners, even a few nurses from assisted living centers slipping us information about patients whose families were circling like vultures. And though the work was overwhelming, it lit a fire in me that age could not extinguish, and Julie, my daughter who had once plotted my downfall, threw herself into it with the fervor of someone clawing her way back from the abyss, staying late to draft reports, learning case law from Eleanor, sitting with tearful widows as they described betrayals almost identical to my own. And in those moments, I began to see glimmers of the girl Charles always believed in, not the hardened woman greed had twisted her into, but the child who used to run barefoot through our backyard chasing fireflies, now channeling that energy into helping those she had once mirrored. And yet, despite the progress, I couldn't shake the feeling of Trent's shadow, because Eleanor's contacts soon discovered he had wired what little remained of his stolen money to relatives in Florida before prison seized his accounts, and whispers circulated that he was already boasting behind bars about appealing, about finding loopholes, about not being finished. And though I told myself justice had clipped his wings, experience warned me that men like him never surrendered quietly, and that unease proved prophetic when nearly a year after the foundation opened, Eleanor called me into her office with grave eyes, laying before me a file filled with photographs of Trent taken by private investigators, not in prison, but walking freely in Miami, dressed sharply, smiling at the arm of a wealthy widow because he had been released on a technicality while his appeal wound through the courts. And though the law required him to remain in the country, he was already back to his old tricks, targeting lonely older women with the same silver tongue he had used on Julie. And when Eleanor told me federal prosecutors were building a new case but needed someone who knew his patterns intimately to testify, I felt my stomach drop because I knew what that meant. I would have to stand in another courtroom, again relive the humiliation, again confront the man who had nearly destroyed me. But before I could speak, Julie stepped forward from the corner where she had been silently listening, her face pale but resolute, and she said with a steadiness that surprised even Eleanor, "I'll testify too. He used me as his weapon once, and I won't let him do it again, not to anyone else." And I looked at her then, truly looked, and saw that for the first time in years, she was no longer the lost woman I had grieved, but someone forged in the same fire that had burned me, someone who understood that redemption was not words, but action. And so we prepared ourselves once more, Eleanor working late nights drafting affidavits, Julie poring over financial spreadsheets to track Trent's shell companies, me practicing my testimony until the memories no longer shook my voice, but sharpened it. And as we worked, the foundation grew stronger. Volunteers pouring in, attorneys offering pro bono hours, retired judges sending letters of support. And by the time the next hearing was scheduled, our modest office had become a beacon, with dozens of elderly clients calling us their lifeline, proof that Charles's foresight had planted not just security for me, but a legacy for many. And when the day of the federal hearing arrived, Julie and I walked into that courthouse side by side, the marble halls echoing with the sound of our footsteps. And though I was nearly 71 now, my shoulders were straighter, my steps steadier, because I was no longer a woman fighting alone, but the founder of a movement. And as Trent sat at the defense table, his smug mask flickering when he saw us, I knew that no matter what tricks he tried, no matter how long his appeals dragged, this time we weren't just defending my home, we were defending countless others who would never again have to face their battles alone. And as I raised my hand to swear in, I thought of Charles, of his letter urging me to use the power with wisdom, and I whispered silently to him, "Don't worry, my love. We're just getting started." The federal trial against Trent became one of the most exhausting experiences of my life. Not just because of the endless days under the courtroom's fluorescent lights or the probing questions from attorneys, but because each victim who testified after me mirrored pieces of my own nightmare. Widows from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Florida describing how Trent, or one of his associates, had approached them with charm, feigned concern, then slowly chipped away at their confidence until they signed over deeds, investments, or access to bank accounts. And as I listened, I felt a knot tighten in my chest, knowing how close I had come to becoming just another statistic. But I also felt a renewed strength because, unlike them, I had Charles's foresight, Eleanor's expertise, and the chance to turn my pain into purpose. And when it was Julie's turn on the stand, I feared the jury might dismiss her as complicit, but she stunned the room with her candor, recounting in painstaking detail how Trent had planted doubts about my mental sharpness, how he whispered comparisons to other elderly neighbors, how he convinced her to interpret every forgotten grocery item as a sign of dementia. And though her voice cracked when she admitted, "I wanted to believe him because I wanted the house, I wanted the life he promised me," her honesty struck deeper than any defense argument could, showing the jury the mechanics of manipulation, how greed preys not just on strangers, but on family bonds. And as she finished, tears streaking down her cheeks, she turned to me briefly, our eyes locking across the courtroom. And for the first time in years, I saw no distance, no coldness, only vulnerability and determination. And that night, when we returned home, exhausted from hours of testimony, she whispered in the kitchen, "Dad was right, Mom. He always believed I'd find my way back. I don't know if I deserve it, but I'm trying." And I placed my hand gently over hers, replying, "Redemption isn't about deserving, Julie. It's about what you do with the second chance." And those words carried us through the final days of the trial, as prosecutors unveiled documents Eleanor had uncovered: fraudulent property transfers, offshore accounts, even emails in which Trent bragged to associates about easy marks, all of which dismantled the polished image his defense tried desperately to maintain. And when closing arguments ended, the judge, the same man who decades earlier had been a nervous clerk I once encouraged, looked down from the bench with a gravity that silenced the room, his voice steady as he declared Trent guilty on multiple counts of wire fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering, sentencing him to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. And though the numbers sounded abstract, the sight of Trent's shoulders sagging, his smirk finally gone, felt like justice, not just for me, but for every woman he had targeted. And when the gavel fell, I felt Charles's presence as vividly as the day he gave me that chipped anniversary mug, as though he were whispering, "You see, Margaret, I told you you'd have the strength." And in the weeks that followed, the story exploded beyond Philadelphia. Newspapers running headlines about the widow who fought back, television crews lining up interviews with the Charles Wilson Foundation. And though I was reluctant to become a public figure, I realized that visibility was our greatest weapon, that for every story we told, another family might think twice before betraying their elders. And so I stood before cameras with Julie at my side, speaking not of vengeance, but of dignity, of the need for laws that protected seniors, of the countless voiceless who deserved defenders. And little by little, donations began pouring in, volunteers swelled our ranks, and legislators reached out asking for input on policy reforms. And on the 1-year anniversary of the foundation, we hosted our first gala, a modest affair in a rented ballroom where elderly clients we had saved from eviction or financial ruin told their stories, some hugging me with tears in their eyes, whispering, "You gave me my life back." And I thought then of the night I had cried alone in my bedroom, believing Julie and Trent had already taken everything from me, marveling at how that moment of despair had become the seed of something so much larger. And as I raised a glass in Charles's name, Julie clinked hers against mine, whispering, "We're not just surviving anymore, Mom. We're building." And though I knew forgiveness was still a long road, I felt for the first time in years that perhaps we were walking it together, step by fragile step, toward a future Charles would be proud of. 5 years passed after Trent's conviction. Years that transformed not only my life, but the lives of hundreds of seniors who found their way to the Charles Wilson Foundation. Because what began as a modest legal aid office run out of a single brick building in Philadelphia blossomed into a national movement, with chapters opening in Pittsburgh, Newark, and eventually Miami, each staffed by attorneys, social workers, and volunteers committed to protecting elders from financial abuse and family exploitation. And though my hair grew whiter and my steps slower, my resolve only deepened, fueled by the faces of those who came through our doors clutching eviction notices, fraudulent contracts, or bank statements they barely understood. And with Eleanor's steady leadership and Julie's tireless dedication, we built programs that didn't just defend, but educated, offering workshops at churches and senior centers, teaching men and women over 65 how to safeguard their assets, how to recognize manipulation, how to say no, even to family. And over time, our advocacy reached lawmakers, sparking hearings on Capitol Hill where I found myself, to my own astonishment, testifying before congressional committees about the hidden epidemic of elder abuse, my voice trembling but strong as I told them, "We are not burdens. We are not assets to be liquidated. We are human beings deserving dignity and protection." And those words, echoed by thousands of letters from victims we had helped, paved the way for what became known as the Wilson Act, a federal law mandating stricter penalties for elder exploitation and providing funding for prevention programs nationwide. And the day it was signed into law, Julie stood beside me in the White House rose garden, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Dad would be so proud, Mom." And I nodded, feeling Charles's presence in the warm spring breeze, knowing he had planted the seed that had grown into this forest of protection. But the most personal vindication came not in Washington or in news headlines, but in the quiet of my own home, the same brick house Julie and Trent had once tried to take from me, where on Sunday mornings Julie now arrived early, carrying fresh bagels and coffee, her laughter echoing once more in the kitchen as we rebuilt not just trust, but tradition. And though the scars of betrayal never fully faded, the tenderness of those mornings proved that redemption, while slow and imperfect, was possible. And one evening as we walked through the Foundation's newest facility, a sprawling converted school now serving as both a legal hub and a temporary housing center for seniors fleeing abuse, Julie stopped me before a newly painted hallway lined with photographs of elders we had helped, each with a small plaque telling their story. And at the very center hung a large portrait of Charles and me on our wedding day. Beneath it inscribed, "The Wilson Legacy, born of love, forged in justice." And as I stood there, my eyes stinging with tears, Julie pressed a handmade scrapbook into my hands, filled with family photos she had painstakingly retrieved over the years, each page paired with letters she wrote reflecting on what those moments meant to her. And at the very back, she had written in her neatest hand, "For my mother, who taught me it's never too late to start again, and for my father, who always believed I would." And in that moment, I wrapped my arms around her without hesitation, not as a conditional gesture, but as a full embrace. Because though forgiveness had been a long, winding road, we had finally reached a place where love and respect outweighed the pain. And as the years continued, I watched Julie grow into the leader Charles always hoped she'd be, taking over as executive director of the foundation while I stepped back into an advisory role, spending more time in my garden among the orchids that had once been my only companions. And yet every bloom now seemed brighter, every sunrise more meaningful, because I knew that what had once been nearly stolen from me, my home, my dignity, my sense of purpose, had become the cornerstone of something that would outlive me. And on the morning of my 75th birthday, as I dressed for the Foundation's anniversary gala, fastening around my neck the pearl necklace my mother had left me, the very one Julie once tried to slip into her purse, I caught my reflection in the mirror, white hair framing a face lined with both grief and triumph. And I thought of the words I would share that evening with the hundreds gathered to celebrate, words I wanted etched into their hearts as they returned to their own families. It is never too late to stand up for yourself. It is never too late to transform pain into purpose. And it is never, ever too late to find your strength, even when those you love the most try to take it from you. And as I stepped into the ballroom filled with applause, I lifted my eyes toward the heavens and whispered, "You were right, Charles, about everything." Feeling in the marrow of my bones that while betrayal had nearly broken me, love, justice, and resilience had built me back stronger, ensuring that my story and his vision would protect countless others long after I was gone.